Hello, today we're talking about a new book by Norman Wirzba called This Sacred Life, Humanity's Place in a Wounded World, published by Cambridge University Press. Norman Wirzba is the Gilbert T. Rowe Distinguished Professor of Christian Theology and Senior Fellow at the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University in the United States. He's written widely on matters of theology, ecology, food, and creation care. And in This Sacred Life, he addresses some of the major challenges facing the planet in the Anthropocene, the name given to the geological era through which we're living, in which the dominant influence on climate and the environment is deemed to be human activity. And it's not a pretty picture that Professor Wirzba paints. That so many of our Anthropocene landscapes, he writes, are populated by toxic dumps, squalid slums, blown up mountains, incarceration facilities, polluted waters, neglected or abandoned neighborhoods, clear-cut forest lands, and denuded soils, suggests that the defining powers of our time have rejected the sacred altogether. This sacred life links the woundedness of our world to greed and distorted notions of human power and freedom that can be seen at work in many areas of culture, from science and education through to industry and agriculture, medicine and economics, politics and social media. The book seeks to renew our sense of the meaning of place and community and of life itself through an alternative vision grounded in an awareness of what it calls humanity's creaturely condition. So, Norman, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us to talk about this sacred life.
Well, it's good to be with you. Thank you.
You've obviously thought a lot about this subject of the Anthropocene. You know, some of us aren't familiar with it. Maybe we know the word, but is this really different from other geological eras? If so, in what way?
Yeah, sure. So the person credited with the term is a fellow named Paul Crutzen, who's an Earth system and meteorological scientist. And he was at a meeting in 2000 in Mexico, and he was talking with his colleagues. And he just came to the realization that we're not living in the Holocene period anymore, which is this geological period that's roughly 12,000 years old. And it's during this period that we have relative climate stability. It's the period in which the great civilizations that we know across the world develop. It's the period in which agriculture takes hold and takes off. And in this roughly 10 to 12,000 year period, there was this understanding that nature is this large power that animates all the possibilities of life. It's the source upon which our economies depend. But Crutzen was saying, but wait a minute. We have done so much to this planet in its basic geomorphological, even biochemical constitution that it's no longer appropriate to think that nature's the big power. We're the big power. I mean, nature still has effects, to be sure, but now human activity in the form of its technological prowess, in the form of its economic reach, in terms of its technological interventions, right? Think about genetic engineering, think about the invention of tens of thousands of poisons and synthetic materials, plastics. He said all of these human productions are now having major effect on all Earth systems and life systems across the globe. And so we shouldn't call it the Holocene anymore. He said we need to call it something else. And so he just blurted out Anthropocene. And the term has really caught hold. It's no longer just the term that some geologists might use. It's a term that is used by people in social sciences, humanities, and the fine arts, because I think this is a term that has captured an imagination which is asking, how have things gotten so terribly wrong? And how might we rethink some of the very basic assumptions that have guided our political economies over the last several centuries, for sure?
The name sort of suggests that you could look at it very positively and say, well, you know, the anthropos, that's man, isn't it? That's us.
Yes.
And you know, maybe is it just that we've entered into a kind of the humanizing of the planet or something like that?
Right. Yeah.
But that's really, it's not that positive connotation.
Well, there are some who want to make it positive, right? There's a group called the Ecomodernists, and these are folks who embrace the dawning of the Anthropocene, because now it puts human beings in this position where they can be the managers of life. And the question now is, do we have the ability, do we have the tools, do we have the knowledge to manage the planet well? And some think that we do, right? So they're convinced that for every problem there will be a technological solution. And so people like Steven Pinker, for instance, they're very big on how, if we just let reason loose and let technology develop however it will, we can live into a glorious future. I think the trouble with these eco-modernists and some of the optimism they feel is that when you talk to Earth system scientists, they will tell you that most of the indicators at the varying levels of ecosystem services are really degraded. I mean, fisheries, forestry, fresh water, soil fertility, right? All the indicators are downward. And that's not to get into the sort of the social realm, where we're talking about, the health of communities and the justice of economies and things of that sort. So they're not as optimistic as some of the other folks are.
You explore alternatives to that name, actually, and one of them is the Capitalism, suggesting that it's the kind of very much this. It's connected with the market, the kind of drives from, I suppose, 19th century really onwards, the Industrial Revolution and so on. Does that appeal to you, the Capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I'm not particularly wedded to the Anthropocene as the term. I think what the Anthropocene does is it gives us an occasion to look historically and see what are some of the major transformations that happen. And one of them, for sure, is the invention of capitalism as a market system. And, we should actually go back to mercantile capitalism, which some historians are saying is better described not as mercantile, but as military or war capitalism, because this is a form of thinking about economy and work and how these two go together to produce wealth that had a profound effect on how we understand people, labor, and also how we understand land, right? So that it now becomes a resource. And the earliest plantations, for instance, sugar plantations in the Caribbean, they manifested already in their very design a new way of thinking about labor and world, right? So that the point now of land is for it to be put to use by investors to make profit. And to many of us, that might seem, well, of course, why wouldn't we think about that as the way to relate to land? But we need to appreciate that in traditional societies, indigenous societies, this would never have been a way to describe humanity's relationship to land. And so we need to sort of have this historical perspective, and the naming of Capitalism can draw our attention to how there are specific political, economic developments that fundamentally altered the way we think about human life, the way we think about animal life, plant life, and then just land more generally.
I mean, the fact that this is a kind of a new word, certainly, and clearly something of a new development in history. I mean, a recent development. I mean, you're pretty keen, however, to stress that actually we can't have a romanticized view of the past, because there's plenty of evidence throughout the world and in history of massive destruction of environments, of land and so on, that's happened historically.
Yes, right. I mean, we know just from archaeological evidence that human beings for thousands of years have used fire to dramatically alter landscapes. We know that human communities, wherever they have been, megafauna have gone extinct, right? So much so that some historians say that wherever human beings seem to be, the stench of death is in their wake. Now, that's a pretty rough way to describe the human presence, but there is just so much evidence to indicate that human beings have not, for the most part, I mean, there are some exceptions, obviously, but for the most part, human beings have not done a very good job living peaceably in their world, or living in their places in such a way that the health and fertility of places is not compromised. And it's important here, not to lump all of human beings together, because, not all people do this, and not all people have the same levers of power, we might say. In fact, we know that so many people have actually been on the wrong end of the power structures that have not just degraded land, but degraded people too.
Yeah, there's another quote that kind of stuck out for me that you've got in the book, is that a bad smell of extinction follows Homo sapiens around the world.
Yeah. That's a hard one to digest, because we want to be much more self-congratulatory, but when we look at the historical record, we've got a lot that we need to answer for.
So, so putting that, that very much there, that human beings have not necessarily changed in nature in the modern era, but there's definitely this change of intensity here of human activity, and it is linked very much with imperialism, with European expansion, particularly with kind of movement into other lands, and with slavery as well. I mean, all of these things you link in with this kind of this growth of the Anthropocene.
Yeah, and I think it's very, very important for people to have this historical, political, economy perspective on these things, because we're not just talking about ideas, right? We're talking about very specific, practical, embodied ways that people were living out, right? An economic vision, a political vision, even an anthropological vision about what we think a human life is and what a human life is for, right? Sometimes I think theologians and philosophers, we can just try to keep it up in the idea level, keeping it all very abstract. But we need to understand that ideas have implications on the ground, literally. And so that if we're going to try to be honest with ourselves, let's not look at the level of piety or rhetoric. Let's look at the level of their built environments. What did these people do? How did they structure their life together economically? What kind of built environments did they construct? Because that's where we get the much more honest expression of what we think is most important, what we think is valuable. And when we look now at the world and we see that there are so many places of destruction or degradation, so many places of abandonment and abuse, we need to know that our ideas are doing some pretty harmful things. So we need to look at ideas and practices together.
Yeah, I mean, the ideas are clearly there as well, and they go hand in hand with the kind of aspirations of a culture, I suppose, and what we want out of life, what we expect out of life, much of which is actually shaped, determined by the kind of the market economy and all of that. But you kind of reduce it to at one point to a desire which seems to be widespread, to live a life without limits.
Right.
To live without a life without limits. And you relate that then to movements like transhumanism, kind of interest in planetary settlement and all of that kind of thing. But that's very much related to kind of very ordinary things that we do on a daily basis, living a life without limits, the things that we expect to be able to do, whether it's tourism, travel, whatever. I mean, yeah, say something about that, because that does seem to be something pretty major for us.
Yeah, sure. And I think here we need to just reflect upon, the experience of people where they have to, at some point in their living, come to terms with the fact that they're finite, that they're fallible, and that they're mortal, right? And what I mean by finite is that we don't have the power to do anything that we want, and we are often frustrated when we exercise whatever power we have. And so from that experience, it's not too hard to say, wouldn't it be great if we had the power to do whatever we want, right? Or when we think about our susceptibility to illness, to pain and suffering, and then ultimately also to death, the question then becomes, wouldn't it be great if we could be immune to suffering, that we could live forever? Or when we think about how we are frustrated by our lack of understanding or knowledge, so we want to have infinite knowledge, right? These are practical experiences that people will have simply in the course of their living. And so the desire to overcome whatever limitations we might have as we experience them is powerful. And of course, the question is, what are we going to do with that frustration? Is the idea then that we will try to eliminate, right, any obstacle to our limitless desires, right? That's one temptation. But we have seen historically over and over again that so much of the desire behind development, progress, what have you, is saturated with violence, right? That the power that we go to is often a violating power. And so my point is not to say that there are no limits that should be tried to overcome, but to recognize that we are creatures, right? That's part of the definition of being a creature. We're finite, we're vulnerable. And so the question then becomes, what is the right kind of power to try to exercise in that kind of a situation, rather than seeking to be the unlimited masters of the earth? Because we know that the effort toward mastery has not been a good history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what really struck me in your discussion of transhumanism and planetary settlement, actually, it wasn't simply the idea that, hey, we need to be concerned about kind of crossing some philosophical boundary here, but the way in which you actually discuss the practicality of all this, the feasibility of all this, in fact, the impossibility of it because of the way that we are made. And that takes you in to the kind of, I suppose, our biological makeup very much, and the way in which we are dependent upon the world in which we live, the earth on which we stand.
Yeah, I mean, it's astounding to me, actually, that we've got some very ostensibly smart people who think it's possible for human beings to live on Mars, right? This is a fantastical misunderstanding of what's so basic about our own human embodied existence, which is to say, our bodies can only live because of our entanglements within millions, billions, trillions of organisms and biogeochemical ecological processes. So that to try to extricate human beings from that and place them on a planet in which none of these biogeochemical features are at work, it's beyond delusional. It's almost comical. But the thing is, we've got not just very smart people advocating it, but we have very rich people and governments financing this sort of work. So in the meantime, we're wasting so much time and money on projects that are doomed to fail, when instead we should be figuring out how do we invest and how do we work on people so that they can make the places where they do belong, where they do fit in the most basic sorts of ways, so that their living there becomes beautiful or peaceful. Because another fantasy is not just the one that we don't have the biogeochemical context up in Mars to support our living. It's the idea that if we're unhappy here, that just going somewhere else, we're suddenly going to be happy. That's another great delusion, right? The unhappiness that people feel, the frustration they feel, needs to be dealt with here in a place where we can live beautifully, rather than try to do it someplace that is entirely hostile to our existence.
This part of your book that's concerned with our relationship with microorganisms, that was one of the most fascinating parts of it. I mean, I'm not a scientist. I've heard a little bit about all of this, but the way you speak about this, the incredible complexity of life that is within us, the trillions of microorganisms that are within us, but that also are out there in the soil. So at one point, in talking about the importance of soil, you say people are variations of soil.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So let's see. There's one way to talk about this, which is to say that Darwin, of course, presented a revolution in our thinking, because we came to understand how through processes of evolutionary development, all sorts of species variation occurred. And this is an incredible story, right? It changed dramatically the way we think about human beings because we no longer see ourselves as entirely separate from the rest of the plant animal kingdoms. The microbiome is another revolution in our understanding of the human place in the world, because if in the Darwinian picture, we can still think of ourselves as instances, individuals within a species, perhaps, the biome has taught us that we are not even single individuals, because most of the genetic material that makes up my body, your body, isn't even our own, right? It's the genetic material of all sorts of microbes. And these microbes, they're not just sort of residing in our bodies, they are essential to the functioning of our bodies in the processes of immunological defense, in the processes of digestion. I mean, there's all sorts of ways in which these microorganisms in our bodies are intimately stitched into our own bodily functioning, so that were they absent, we would simply die. Now, what this means, of course, is that a human being is never simply one, is never simply single. We are always a community of creatures, or as I like to say, you are a zoo. And if you understand that, suddenly now we have to realize about how we are so closely tied to the most basic features of our planet. And what could be more basic to a terrestrial being than the soil from which all of our sustenance derives, right? Soil is the basis for plant life, for animal life, and therefore also our life. Soil is the basis for the plant life that makes oxygen available to us to breathe. Plants, obviously, soil are crucial to the way we think about hydrological cycles, carbon cycles. So not just in a figurative sense, but in a very literal sense, right? Our lives are constantly passing through soil, receiving from soil. And so the point I want to make is that the Genesis story in chapter 2, which just describes God holding up soil, breathing into it to form the first human being, it's not simply figurative. From a scientific point of view, it's entirely accurate, because without soil, we couldn't possibly exist.
So Adama, the earthy one, we're all earthy, we're all soil people.
Exactly.
People.
Exactly.
Yeah, remarkable. Yeah. And it's this sense of us being kind of hosts of this ecosystem within us,
Right.
but that we are somehow hosted ourselves in the
Right.
same way by the lands, the earth on which we live.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's just so many dimensions to this. There's obviously the physiological side of this, where we begin to appreciate more and more the intimacy and the intricacy of our dependence upon terrestrial processes. But there's also, I think, and this is also a very, very important thing to say, it helps us understand that by being so stitched into this world, the world is where we belong, right? So Ed Wilson, who's a very famous conservationist and biologist, he said we shouldn't call our time the Anthropocene, we should call it the Eremocene, because the Eremocene is the word that we would use for the age of loneliness. I think a lot of people feel alienated from this planet, from this earth. And wouldn't it be beautiful for people to understand how their existence on this earth is not an accident, that the world is not just amenable to our living here, but facilitates it, nurtures it, welcomes it. And this, of course, is something that indigenous peoples have been saying for generations, that the world in which we live is not populated by objects. The world in which we live is populated by kin, right? A community of life. And we are intricately involved in this membership of life. And were we to recover that sense, feel it, not just think about it, but feel it through our bodies, viscerally through the eating that we do, would that be at least somewhat of an inducement to have us take a different approach to the world that nurtures us by us deciding to nurture it in return?
And you go on, I mean, it's a kind of natural thing to move on from the soil, talking about the importance of soil, to talking about the importance of plants. And and the way in which we can learn from plants. And there's something here about, well, certainly social mobility and the rootlessness of modern people that you kind of, you draw this parallel with the life of plants. Now, tell us a bit about that, and how that can really relate to people who have legs.
So I had a great deal of fun working on this section on plant life, because historically we've got this thing called the great chain of being. It was given to us in one form by Aristotle, who said, we got different levels of life. We got soil on the bottom, plants above, animals above them, and then we've got humans above them, and then angels and God. Now, what people have been tempted to say is, well, plants are such a lower order of being that we don't really need to attend to them very much. They're not that interesting. The trouble, however, is that we have discovered that plants are in fact very interesting, that they're actually social beings too, and that the complexity of their lives is something we should marvel about. And so the question for me became, how do we learn about life by thinking about plants? And then think, well, what does this mean for human beings? Because my point is not to say that a human being is the same as a plant. That would be ridiculous. But it is to say that perhaps Aristotle was right in also arguing that the higher orders depend upon the functions of the lower orders. And plants have this remarkable thing to teach us about what it means to be in a place and be not just a growing presence, but also a nurturing presence at the same time, right? Plants, by their very rootedness, right? They receive nurture from the soil, but they also send nurture into the soil because of their photosynthetic activity and growth. They send sugars down into the root systems that nurture the life in the soil. Now, that's a beautiful way to be in a place, right? Receive nurture, but give nurture at the same time, because that's what rootedness does. And I wanted to think then about, well, what does this mean for human life? Because as you say, we have legs, we're mobile, we can get around. We're not stuck in one place. But what we've realized is that our mobility, as beautiful as it can be, is also a problem, because when we become so mobile as to forget our entanglements, our dependence upon soil, we abuse the very sources of life that feed us. And so we need to learn something about rootedness. And I don't mean that we need to become like a plant that only ever stays in one place its whole life, but we need to figure out something about what plants teach us, which is about this receiving, giving dynamic, which is going to be very important for us, because so many of the places have been abandoned, they've been degraded, they've been destroyed by us. And so we're going to have to figure out, how are we going to receive nurture from the world and at the same time nurture it in return? Because if it only ever becomes this one way where we're just taking, exploiting, mining, so forth, we know that we're going to exhaust the world entirely and therefore put our lives in jeopardy. And so the section on rootedness became so important to me, because we have to rethink in the most fundamental ways how best to position ourselves in the world.
I mean, you touch on things that are kind of, they're so ingrained in us now that we don't even think about what we're doing. The invention of the map,
Right.
you know, and the age of discovery and so on. You quote somebody as saying this led to a kind of age of global camping, the rise of global camping, of perpetual tourists, where your kind of place really, it doesn't have a significance really all of its own, only in relationship to how we can use it. But then GPS systems,
right?
You know, give us your critique of the GPS system. What does that do to our sense of place?
Yeah. So, I mean, GPS systems are not entirely evil, right? They have their uses. So, I mean, I use them when I'm going somewhere where I've never been. It helps me get to where I want to go. But we need to understand that GPSs are very limited in what they do, because they help us get to a destination, but they don't help us understand the significance of the destination or help us understand anything that we cross over along the way. So just to think about how, when people thought about places previously, think about indigenous peoples, for instance. in their map making of the world, they understood places in terms of their deep sort of existential significance, right? That bay became the place to do fishing. This creek became the place to do X, Y, and Z. This is where we found a den where we could, encounter certain forms of life, or this is where medicinal plants and herbs exist, or right? Places were characterized, were named in terms of their significance for the life of a community. When you've got just a name on a map, usually a name that's based upon some discoverer, right? Usually a white man, the place itself loses its significance because its reference is not to it, but to some person who's no longer there. And so you go to a place not so as to understand how your life is enfolded within it, how you may have responsibilities for it. You go to a place as a tourist to look, or perhaps as a miner to take. And that changes in pretty fundamental ways the way we think about the world. The world becomes a place to move over or to move across rather than a place to move into. And through experience, through time, through tradition, through work, understand what's happening there. Because if we don't understand what's happening in our places, if we don't understand why places are significant or why they matter, we put ourselves in a position where it's much more likely that we'll do damage to those places, right? And that's, I think, the important thing that gets lost when we navigate through the world exclusively through maps or GPS.
I mean, at this point, I mean, as with so many of these subjects that you address, you realize the huge scale of the problem here and the way that our whole patterns of life kind of militate against a lot of what you're talking about. And how on earth do we get out of it? Because, travel, I mean, the kind of the whole way in which in Britain, I mean, people now expect to go abroad, to fly, to get, to travel. I know young people want to go off on a gap year and, travel the world. I mean, there's just this expectation of that. And then North America, I mean, it's almost like an entire society has been built up around this notion of mobility, move on, get a new job, whatever. It's like the organizing principle of the world. I mean, do you just see some of these issues as just so huge here? How on earth do we begin to solve this?
It's a really good question, a really hard one. And I think there's some things I would say in response. One, I think a growing number of people, especially younger people, are realizing there's something deeply wrong about the inherited patterns, the inherited priorities by which they are being told to organize their world and their life. And they're recognizing that the patterns that got us to this mess are not likely to get us out. And so they're looking for different ways to think, different ways to live, different forms of economy, different forms of politics. And so this sacred life becomes one small effort in this job of trying to give people tools by which to analyze what's wrong, but also some ideas about how we might envision our life differently. And that means instead of rejecting, for instance, finitude, fallibility, mortality, vulnerability, how do we learn to embrace these and live in such a way, communally, socially, economically, so as to make this life as good as possible? How do we learn to develop economic forms that don't rest upon exploitation? We know that they exist because they've been seen, they've been put to the test. And clearly, it's not going to be individuals doing it all, but it's going to require people inspired with new ways of thinking and being, who can then take this word and put it into practice in different parts of the globe. I mean, this is how things have always changed. I imagine before the 1840s, there wasn't Karl Marx. And yet look at the effect that Karl Marx has had on the world, right? His ways of thinking and being. And I know the questions are very, very complicated, but ideas have power. And we don't obviously know about what are going to be the levers that precipitate the massive forms of change that we need. But we need to have people who can give us tools to think clearly about the systems in the very broad reach of their exercise. And that's why, this sacred life is a bit outrageous in its scope, because it's trying to talk about so much all at once. But I think we need a book like that. And I hope other people will do similar things where they will, from their particular points of view, their own traditions, try to come up with ways to analyze what's wrong about our time, about our culture, and propose models that will be better.
I mean, the development of a sense of place and rootedness, which, I mean, as you point out, so many, Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples, it just comes naturally to them. But they tell stories about their place. Their memories are connected with place, as you point out, and all of these ways are ways of expressing, but also nurturing a love for the place,
right,
as well. And I wonder, in the kind of urban environments that so many of us live in, anonymous, even the places that we go every day, perhaps to shop, or to school or whatever, we don't tell stories about them. It involves a kind of level of imagination here and creativity that at the moment we haven't got.
Yeah, no, I like very much the fact that you've introduced these two words, love and imagination, because I think you're absolutely right that these are crucial going forward. And I think a growing number of people recognize that. They may not know how to articulate it, but I mean, I think about the development of local economies, about relationships at food markets, farmers markets, farm to fork relationships that develop there. These become ways in which people can inhabit stories. People want to know more where their food comes from. They maybe want to know the person who's providing for their home care. They want to know communities better. And so, yes, there are many, many trends that go against this, right? Trends that move towards anonymization and trends that move toward just a kind of bureaucratic efficiency mode of engagement. But there are a number of people who are pushing back against that, right? They're saying, we're interested in craft. We're interested in the skill and the story of the skill development when we're doing things, buying things, even doing things ourselves. And so the question is, how do we help mobilize people? And how do we work to affect the kinds of sort of economic change, community development that will encourage this, right? So think just in terms of our built environments, right? The built environments that we have do so much to shape the patterns of our lives, right? If you're in America, you're likely going to be in a place where there's not a lot of public transportation unless you're in some of the major cities. And so you're automatically reliant upon a car. Well, cars have the effect of eliminating sidewalks. They have the effect of congestion. They have the effect of speed, right? A kind of obliviousness to where you are. Well, a number of people are saying, we're not going to do that. We're going to advocate for public transportation. We're going to advocate for walkways. We're going to advocate for more pedestrian use, boulevards, benches, parks. And so they're making changes in their built environment so as to facilitate more personal encounter and therefore fight against some of the impersonality that we see so much around us. And so those are, I think, really hopeful steps that people are taking.
So all of this analysis that you've got in this critique is very much the specific points. They're all bound up with a sense of the sacred, the loss of it, the renewal of it, the rediscovery of it. What does the sacred really mean to you? I mean, obviously lots of people have written about this, talked about it. How you don't sort of define it as such in the book, and yet you obviously touch on it at many points. What does it mean to you?
Yeah, so I think, the reason I don't give a two-line definition right off is because I think, first of all, the sacred has been described and experienced by lots of communities and traditions in very powerful and distinct ways. But I think in the general sense, when we're talking about the sacred, we're talking about the world as gift, life as a gift, and that the gift is good, right? The gift is beautiful. And this is important because when you speak about the world as sacred, as gift, as beautiful and good, you're going against a very straight up materialist way of thinking, which is very dominant in our culture, which says the world just is. It's just matter in motion. There's nothing about it that would suggest it's immediately good or intrinsically good or beautiful. It certainly isn't the reflection, the material manifestation of some divine intention that thinks it's good for it to be. And of course, this way of speaking, this materialist philosophical approach, is deeply damaging, not just to the world, because if it's just matter that just is, we can do with it whatever we want. But it's also damaging to us, because what it does is it reduces the significance of any human life, right? So that we can think, well, we're just matter in motion too. There's nothing about us that suggests that we're precious or worthy of cherishing. And I think that's where it really comes down for me in the very practical sense that if you believe that the world is sacred, two things happen immediately. One, you recognize that we inhabit a world and life that can be violated, right? That's one. And the second one is when you realize that the world is a sacred gift and that the creatures with you are sacred gifts, you recognize that there's now a need for cherishing. There's a need for care. There's a need for celebration. And I think what's missing in so many of the larger metaphysical or philosophical accounts of reality that dominate our world, that are particularly active in something like neoliberal philosophy and economics, is there's no sense that life is worth cherishing. There's no ability to speak about violation of life forms, because everything now becomes reduced to units of production or units of consumption that are to be managed according to the logics of efficiency, maximization, profitability, and so forth. And if we don't have something like the sacred that talks about the sanctity of life, we lose the ability to talk about its violation.
It's interesting, isn't it, the way in which, I mean, really since the Enlightenment, I suppose, the sacred has been seen as the enemy of humanity, the enemy of progress in
Right.
so many ways, you know, through institutions, priests, you know, kings who are a God-ordained sort of thing, you know, oppression is almost written into the system. There was when Salman Rushdie got into trouble over that novel, The Satanic Verses, a few years back, he wrote a response of his own, a lecture called "Is Nothing Sacred?" And, you know, basically he tries to be nice to the people who are kind of going after him by saying, well, you know, obviously it's important to you, but look, you know, I can't think anything is really sacred, because to respect the sacred is to be paralyzed by it. And, you know, to respect the sacred is and that's the critique, isn't it? That somehow or other it's limiting human potential. It's deliberately restricting what we can be. Addresses this idea of limits that and here's you come in saying, oh no, the sacred is connected with limitation. It must
be. Yeah, I mean, I think it's no accident that the account that I develop around creation and creatureliness comes out of Jewish sources that Christians, of course, then have also taken up. But where else does the prophetic imagination come from, if not from precisely this dynamic of a world given as good? And where else do you find this prophetic imagination that puts a no in front of the abuse and violation of beings, creatures? What I worry about is that, yes, I understand Rushdie saying how the sacred can be the paralyzing power, because there have been, in history at least, multiple forms of religious expression that are very much about power and coercion, about limiting human life, making human life subservient. And those are all dreadful theologies. But they mistake the logic of creation, as I describe it in the book, which is to say that creator and creatures don't exist in competitive relationship with each other. This is a fundamental mistake that many Christians make, because on this way of thinking, for God to be great, I must be nothing. I must be made low, is some of the language that, I heard growing up. But when we recognize that God and creatures don't exist on the same plane of being, we can actually reverse it and say that in the flourishing of creatures, God is all the more glorified, right? So this ceases this competitive relationship that people seem to think exists between God and creatures. God is not in competition with creatures. God only loves creatures into their being. So it's not about paralyzing life. It's about liberating life. That's what the sacred is fundamentally about. And this is, of course, what we see in scripture, right? It's the massive liberation theme that we get obviously in the Israelite exodus out of Egypt. But it's also a liberation theme that we see in the Gospels, where Jesus's acts of feeding and healing and exercising and reconciling, these are all acts of liberation, right? They're acts that liberate people from hunger, from disease, from loneliness and alienation and demon possession. And so Jesus's work as the creator, right? Scripture has affirmed this too, right? Become this emancipatory project that don't strive for limitlessness, but they strive for maximal flourishing of whatever creaturely life is being liberated.
It's great that you do turn to scripture to resource our sense of all of this, and particularly the Genesis passages on creation, but also on our understanding of who Jesus Christ is. I mean, that's all incredible. But of course, that it's those things that can be, I think, people can be immediately suspicious. Oh, so you're talking about the sacred, you want to bring that stuff back? It's like they'll go anywhere for a sacred kind of shot in the arm, except to these places, to biblical places. I mean, have you found resistance to bringing the Genesis accounts into the conversation?
Well, what I try to do, on the one hand, if I'm speaking to audiences that have some allegiance to Scripture, I want to help them see that it's not just Genesis, right? It's throughout Scripture, Old and New Testaments, right? That's very, very important to say. But then when I'm not talking to religiously inclined audiences, just more straight up secular audiences, they constantly throw up in my face, well, but religions have been the source of so much violence and horror. They're Christian missionaries were colonialists and all the rest. And it's true. But what we have to understand too is that these religious traditions have done a tremendous amount of good in the world. And if we were to only evaluate a religious tradition because of the bad things it does, we would also have to evaluate all educational institutions, all political institutions, all medical institutions. They have done tremendous horrors, historically speaking. But we don't say, let's dispense with education or dispense with medicine or dispense with science, even though science has given us an atomic bomb. We know that medicine has given us all sorts of euthanasia. There's just any number of things that we can point to that show how these varying institutions that are the bedrock of culture have done tremendous harm. So the question then is not, how do we get rid of religion or how do we get rid of education, but how do we figure out what's good in religion and what's good in education and good in medicine? Because we know these have done tremendous good. And that's something that we can't lose sight of, because if we're just going to throw out traditions because they have a history of wrongdoing, we have nothing left.
I remember reading, and I think it was by the scholar of mythology, Joseph Campbell. Mm-hmm. He was talking about this photograph of planet Earth that you actually talk about in your book, the Earthwise photograph that NASA released. And he says, we don't have the resources actually in any of the kind of great religions of the world to deal with this. They're not there because they're not able to kind of both address this planet floating in this humongous universe, but also the capabilities of human beings who took the photograph.
Mm.
And now your analysis of this photograph is just so interesting in the book, but I wonder, how do you respond to that, that somehow or other that image of the world did give us a totally gobsmacking perspective,
Right.
all of a sudden. And are the resources there within the Christian faith to cope with it?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I don't know exactly what Joseph Campbell was trying to drive at here, but what I am concerned about with that image is that what it does is it lures us potentially into thinking that human beings can actually live apart from Earth, right? That's the great delusion, I think. Not remembering that for this space capsule to get out into the atmosphere like this, to do the photograph even, everything that these astronauts needed came from Earth. And we know this because they couldn't stay out there very long. They had to return. And if they didn't return, they would surely die. So this becomes a perspective, which, yes, it's beautiful because we could get back and take this picture. It's amazing. It's a technological feat to marvel at. But the question is whether or not that technological feat also did a whole lot to distort our thinking about our actual place in the world. And that's the concern that I wanted to raise in the book. A lot of people think that this is an image for Earth Day and for conservation of Earth. I think it's the opposite message, because it tempts us to think that we're not, in fact, always necessarily terrestrial bound creatures. And then if that's the case, should we be spending more of our effort to figure out how do we live where we are on this fragile blue floating planet, so as to not make our lives so difficult, so fraught, so sickly that we have to try to leave Earth, right? That's the bigger question.
Mm. There are so many good things that you draw out of the Genesis accounts, particularly the whole notion of Sabbath and rest, which you contrast with the kind of the restlessness of human beings within the Anthropocene.
Right.
That rest is not inactivity as far as you're concerned, is it?
Right. I mean, it can be an activity, because I think we've had the experience of doing something that we absolutely love, and it's not at all tiring. It's actually energizing, right? It's inspiring, and we don't want it to end, right? So paradoxically, we're talking about an action which makes us feel more alive, right? So it's not degrading in the ways that restlessness is degrading of us, right? When we're restless, we're saying we're not happy with what we are, with what we do, with what we have, with who we are with. And so we're constantly wanting more, do more, have more, be more. And to come to rest is to come into the presence of where we are and find it enough. And sometimes that means just straight out stopping. But I think we're mistaken if we believe that Sabbath rest means taking a nap on a couch, because Sabbath is about reorienting our whole lives so that people can come into the presence of where they are and who they're with and find there the love of God being realized, and therefore wanting to be with them, right? So if we think about the first Sabbath sunrise, when God looks out onto this freshly made, beautifully made creation, God doesn't want to take a nap. What God wants to do is be present to the world, because what God sees in this world is God's own love, variously made, visible, fragrant, tactile, auditory, delicious. And this becomes a profound immersion in the created world rather than a detachment from it. And I think our understanding of rest, when we think of it simply in terms of stoppage or checking out, is we miss that experience of immersion in which we figure out how to delight in a world that's beautiful and good and worthy of our love and cherishing. Now, that can sound, very bourgeois, but we have to understand that the Sabbath also had as part of its teaching the idea that the delight or the pleasure of one should not be premised on the misery of another, which is why in the Sabbath commandment, the fourth commandment, it says very clearly that it's not just one wealthy man, pater familias or something like that, who gets to rest. It's the whole household and the land and the animals, right? Because the whole of creation is to experience in the presence of each other the love of God at work.
Mm. You, I mean, obviously pull various themes out of the creation stories. Adama, we've talked about the connection with soil, but also the garden. The people are called to garden, you say. Mm-hmm. And now, how literal are you about that? Because it does seem to me that what you really are making a very, very physical connection with land in what you're writing about. I'm a useless gardener. I've got a backyard, as you would say in North America, that needs some attention, and it's usually me hacking back brambles. That's about it, really. Yeah. How serious do I need to get about this?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a good question. And I don't expect everyone to become an expert gardener or an expert farmer. It's difficult work. It requires a very complex intelligence and a very wide skill set. And so my point is not to say everybody should grow all their own food that they're going to eat, for instance. But I do want to suggest that we need to understand the context, the geophysical, biochemical context of our own nurture. That means we have to know where our food comes from, the conditions under which food grows. And we need to appreciate something about the vulnerability, the fragility, but also the surprise and the wonder of what a garden manifests. And so having some experience with a gardener, even if it's a frustrating, failing one, is important, because it teaches us not to take for granted that there will be tomatoes or apples or whatever. So that's a really important thing for people to understand. But when I talk about gardening, it's not the only activity, right? Because gardens are always a fundamental source of our nurture. And I'm extrapolating garden in a very broad sense. None of us could live without the fruits and vegetables that come from plants. And so gardening life is a non-negotiable for human existence. Even so, the larger philosophical point, I would say, is that we need to learn to understand the sources of nurture that are important to us so that we can become a source of nurture to them. So if you're in an urban context, you're not a green thumb, you're not a master gardener, you can still do the work of understanding what in your neighborhood makes possible the well-being of the community that lives there. And if you discover, well, it's a park or it's a school system or it's, a set of shops that are keeping this community alive, what can you do to nurture those to make sure that they survive and thrive? Because it's this exercise of nurturing the world that nurtures you that's the fundamental thing that we need to appreciate as the sort of basic principle undergirding. And I think that's what God is saying to this first Adam in the garden. When God puts this first Adam in the garden and says, take care of it, right? The point is for us to participate in God's gardening ways of the world, which are the ways of nurture, protection. And if we don't know what it means to nurture and protect other life, communities, places, we're going to do damage. And so this command is not a punishment. It's actually an invitation to join with God in the feeding and the healing and the repair of this world.
Jesus talked a lot about seeds and plants and farming in his teaching, and you draw attention to this. And but I wonder, it's obviously indicative of very much an agrarian kind of context that he was speaking into. But I wonder if it's kind of symptomatic of our problems that we want to maybe we don't connect very strongly with those sort of images anymore, and we think, okay, well, let's find some other way of speaking about the same stuff, or find some other bits of the teaching that kind of aren't so, I don't know, rural.
Anti.
You know, but you seem to be saying that actually, no, we need to pay more attention to these biological images that Jesus is using, because that's the way we will get this really earthy understanding of who we are.
Yeah. So for instance, you know, the Young Oxford English Dictionary recently has removed some words that refer to natural realities, certain birds like the wren, for instance, because they're not words that are featured in the lives of ordinary urban kids. And so with these biological terms erased from the dictionary, they've added these other terms that reflect the life of cell phones and computers, right? So chat rooms and, you know, Google, and these words now are in the dictionary. Now, the trouble with our just sort of excising these biological images is that we might actually start to think we're not biological beings, that we really are machine beings. Because if we keep talking about how, you know, our brain is hardware and the way we think is software that we can upload or download or what have you, we'll start treating each other like machines. And we're not machines. We're biological beings. And so it's absolutely crucial that we not forget the realities of land, plants, weather, because this is part of the difficulty that we're in right now. People can't imagine that if we hurt the geobiochemical ecological systems of this planet, that we're hurting ourselves. And the reason we don't think that we're hurting ourselves is because we think that we're somehow exempt from natural processes. And that, again, it's a fundamental delusion. We're not machines, even though there are folks in the transhumanist camp who want to say that we are reducible to machines. And I think that's a disaster.
We've been talking about Norman Wirzba's new book, This Sacred Life, the humanity's future in a wounded world. And it's published by Cambridge University Press. Norman, thanks so much for talking to us about this fascinating book.
Well, thank you. It's been great to talk with you.
Good to see you, folks. We'll do this again soon. Bye for now.